Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to AJ108 Criminal Investigation. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 9, where we're going to take a look at gangs, criminal activities of gangs, and we're also going to take just a little look at ritualistic crimes and the issues and challenges that you might face during those types of investigations. So a lot of content to cover, so let's go ahead and just jump right into this week's lecture. I wanted to start off with a very cool show. So this is on A&E, and it's a 3 or a 4-part series. It might be 3, but it's called The Streets of Compton. And it actually includes 2 individuals that I worked with in the city of Compton earlier in my law enforcement career. And the gentleman on the left, Tim Brennan, and the gentleman on the right, Bob Ladd. And both of these individuals were working with the Compton PD gang unit and were involved in the investigation of several high-profile cases, including the Tupac case. So I would recommend that you watch it. There's a lot of information on gangs, but also it kind of takes you through the world of hip hop a little bit as well, and how music kind of intertwines in some of these things. So a big recommend that you watch it. And then also they wrote a book together. So it's called Once Upon a Time in Compton. And again, the book goes from gangster rap to the gang wars, the murders of Tupac and Biggie. Talks a little bit about NWA. And again, it features Tim Brennan and Bob Ladd. So a great read. You may want to pick it up and kind of learn a little bit how those things how the officers dealt with the gangs back in that particular time. So I want to start off with something that I hope gets your attention. Now, when I was working in Compton, California, I noticed that, you know, a lot of these different street gangs, and you'll learn this, have their particular areas, right? They have their turf, their territory, if you will. And they are very well defined. You can map them out. And of course, the larger of the 2 gangs out in Compton would be the Bloods and Crips, okay? And it was so defined, and again, this I hope gets you thinking, that the 2 high schools in that particular community were actually separated by Blood and Crip. And maybe it didn't always end up that way, but if it didn't, you would find if you were if you were a Blood, you're not going to go to a Crip school. And if you're a Crip, you're not going to go to a primarily Blood school. So just to show you how deep this runs, in Compton, again, there's 2 high schools. On the left, you can see Centennial High School. And here's a picture of the inside of the gym and the outside of the school. And if you notice, it is primarily red. Okay, that doesn't mean that there's not any blue, and you can see here there's some on the basketball court, okay, but primarily red. Because Centennial High School, it was on the north end of the city of Compton, bordering Los Angeles, and it was primarily Bloods. And in the center of the city, a little bit further towards the center, maybe even a little bit south, but towards the center and south, was Compton High School. And again, they were blue. And typically, if you were a Crip gang member, this is where you're going to go to high school. So, you know, you can call it coincidence if you want, but it really isn't. Because I remember finding that out early on as I was a rookie officer in Los Angeles. So just some interesting information. So let's kind of jump into our lecture. So gangs have been of interest and concern for centuries. Street gangs have existed in the United States for most of the country's history and have been studied since probably about the 1920s. Now, the 1900s saw street gangs flourishing, influenced by such mobsters like Al Capone. And gangs continue to pose a problem for law enforcement currently, in the 21st century. And I threw a couple of, photos in looking at some of the old time gangs, if you will, and they even called them gangs back then. So, again, you can see how things have kind of changed and morphed a little bit. Now, belonging to a gang in itself is not illegal in this country. However, many activities that gangs engage in, they are illegal. Because gangs, they traffic in drugs, they commit shootings, assaults, robberies, extortion, and they commit other felonies, and they terrorize neighborhoods. And, gangs really exist in almost every community to some level or another. So to investigate gang-related crimes effectively, law enforcement personnel really need to understand the makeup of these organizations and what types of crimes that they're going to they commit. So what types of crimes that you're going to expect to see, and how to deal with those special challenges of gangs. Maybe how to identify the members. So a lot of information. So let's start with defining a gang. So although most people are easily able to form an image in their mind, perhaps when they think of a gang, defining a gang is a bit more difficult. And no single agreed upon definition really exists. Actually, one of the greatest challenges or even impediments to the collection of accurate gang-related data is the lack of a national uniform definition of a gang used by everybody, by all federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. So you can see it's problematic because maybe we're not getting the numbers right because the feds define it one way, some states define it other ways, agencies, local law enforcement and agencies might define it a different way. So it would be better if we had one definition, right? So some definitions emphasize criminal activity, whereas others stress territory. Now, one commonly accepted definition is that a gang is a group of individuals with a recognized name and symbol that forms an allegiance for a common purpose, and they engage in unlawful criminal activity. So, again, many states have their own definitions, but as you see on the slide in front of you, typically you're going to find these kinds of things, the group of individuals, the recognized name and symbol, they're going to have an allegiance to each other for a common person. So they're going to do things on behalf of that group or that gang. And again, they're going to engage in continuous unlawful activity. So they're not going to just do it one time. But many states do have their own definitions. So let's look at a couple of those definitions that from a couple of groups, if you will. So the National Alliance of Gang Investigators, their association defines a gang as 3 or more persons. So already you can see a little bit of difference. They're actually putting a number on it. Because if it's too vague, like the previous definition, is one person a gang? Can you have a one-man gang? So here they're using numbers. So 3 or more persons, common identifying sign, symbol, or name. All right, we've seen that. Individually or collectively engage in or have engaged in criminal activity. and they create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. So this is one definition. Now, another definition that typically most law enforcement officers will use will be one that's found in the California Penal Code under section 186.22 subsection F. And it's pretty close to the one we just read, but it defines a gang as any ongoing organization with 3 or more members with a common name, sign, or symbol, where one of its primary activities is the commission of crimes that are listed, and they're listed actually in the section. So in the section 186.22, there are certain crimes listed, and that the members engage in a pattern of criminal activity. And it also, the gangs will fall under the STEP Act. But this is one that a lot of law enforcement officers will typically use because it's in the penal code for California. So hopefully that makes sense. So gang investigators, again, they really must be aware that many states have legislatively enacted their own definitions of a gang that all local and state law enforcement agencies are going to be mandated to follow. Now, a state-by-state list of this criteria used to define gangs and gang members may be found online at the National Gang Center at their government website, so the NGC's website. So you can look at different states' information. But typically, I would suggest, especially for what we're learning today, that we look more at the California definition because that's where we are. All right, so what about the extent of gangs? So now that we've kind of defined them, let's look at the extent. So the last quarter of the 20th century saw significant growth in gang problems across the country. In the 1970s, less than half of the states reported youth gang problems, but by the late 1990s, every state and the District of Columbia reported gang activity. And during that same time period, the number of cities reporting youth gang problems really it expanded nearly tenfold. So you started to see this increase in youth gang problems. Now, gangs range in size from small groups of, let's say 3 to 5, to as many as several thousands. Nationally known gangs such as the Crips number around 50,000 and the Bloods number around 20,000 to 30,000. And large gangs are normally broken into smaller groups or cliques, but are known collectively under one name. So, there's a lot. And if you look at a report in 2011, the National Gang Threat Assessment published by the National Gang Intelligence Center reported an estimated 1.4 million gang members and more than 33,000 gangs that were criminally active in the United States. So you can see that the problem is pretty big. Now again, this was, a little while ago. The numbers are probably going to be a lot more if we were to look at them today. So keep in mind then that the gang problem is not restricted just to metropolitan areas, because you can see the numbers are extremely large. As society in general has become more mobile, gangs and gang members have also increased their mobility, contributing to this migration of gangs. And some people kind of look at it like a cancer. The gangs are spreading to all communities across America. And when they do this, they're actually, of course, establishing new territories, right? And because they're involved in drugs and other types of criminal activity, they're increasing their distribution of drugs, etc., which is going to increase their profit. So the extent of gangs, I mean, it is a widespread issue. Social media and even other forms of technology, they've also played an essential role in illicit activities of gang members. Over the past few years, gang members' utilization of technology, specifically social media, has risen significantly, and this same technology is also helping out law enforcement investigators as they conduct these gang-related crime investigations. So while social media does work for the gang members as well, it's a tool the gang investigators are using. So it kind of works both ways. And here's something kind of interesting I thought I would share with you. So this is a graph showing social media platforms that are most frequently reported to be used by prison gang members. Now, the first question that should pop in your mind as an investigator is, how are they using this? Wouldn't it be monitored? Well, a lot of cell phones get smuggled into prisons. Sometimes prisoners are able to use computers, etc., or they bribe individuals perhaps to be able to get online, etc., whether it be through a phone or through a computer. But if you look at it, you can see, and it's a little bit blurry at the bottom, but you have Facebook is number one, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Google+, Snapchat, Flickr, WhatsApp, and Moco. Or Moco Space, I think is what it's called, which I haven't really heard too much about. But and there are probably a few other ones by now, but that's kind of an interesting graph to show you. So what now are some reasons that people might join gangs? So we've kind of we've defined the gangs. We've looked at the extent of the issue, or at least the extent of gangs themselves by the numbers. So now, why would a person join gangs? Well, gangs provide protection to youth from violent peers, and gangs also offer a sense of acceptance, belonging, and importance to their members that society and family may not be able to provide. And gang membership may be a way to obtain money, power, and drugs. And some people join gangs because they come from a gang-involved family, and it's simply what they're expected to do. And if you take a criminology class again, you'll learn about how some of those things are passed down from one generation to another. And that's AJ108, if I could plug the criminology course. So, recent research has revealed three common themes regarding why males and females join gangs. So both genders, if you will. So first would be neighborhood disadvantage. Second would be having gang-involved family and friends. And then third would be a parent-child relationship or lack thereof. And most importantly, lack of supervision. And along with that, I always like to add in possible substance abuse and addiction. So, the big one for you to kind of remember, and all of those are good reasons, but a lack of parental attachment is an important risk factor in adolescent gang membership, with results of several studies suggesting that youth, particularly females, join gangs to satisfy the need for that close emotional relationship that they just aren't finding at home with their real family. So we have those three common reasons, but keep in mind that that lack of parental attachment is really, really a major factor, specifically for females that get into gangs. And I spoke a minute ago about money, and some people will just kind of say, well, why don't we just tell them that it's not a good thing to join gangs? Well, I'm showing you this picture for a reason. So think about this. How difficult do you think it's going to be for you as a law enforcement officer, or anyone for that matter, to tell, let's say, a young 15-year-old kid living in a disadvantaged neighborhood that might have these friends that are involved in gangs, and there's not a lot of money coming in the house, and maybe it's only a one-parent household, but just the circumstances aren't great. How are you going to tell that kid that not having money and cool gold jewelry and a car and a girlfriend and all this other stuff that he sees others with in these gangs, how are you going to tell them that that's not good? How are you going to tell them that, you're making all of this money selling drugs and you're helping to pay your parents' bills? How are you going to tell them that that's bad? Now, there are ways that we can do this, but these are one of the challenges that you're going to be faced with. So think about these things as we continue to talk about gangs and some of the issues. So what about the different types of gangs? So gangs can be differentiated in many ways, such as age, being like youth gangs, or race and ethnicity, Hispanic gangs, Native American gangs, or gender composition, meaning female gangs, or the setting, like street gangs or prison gangs, and even the type of activity, like drug gangs. Now, the National Gang Intelligence Center, which is a great place for you to get information, notes basically 3 types of gangs. Now, yes, you can find other, subcategories, etc., but they basically break them up into 3 larger gangs to look at. And that would be street gangs, prison gangs, and outlaw motorcycle gangs. So again, the NGIC has identified 3 general types of gangs: street gangs, prison gangs, and outlaw motorcycle gangs. So let's take a look at some of those. Now, again, just before we kind of delve into this, there is no one form of street gangs, and this is kind of what we're going to start with. We're going to start with street gangs. These gangs can be large or small, long-term or short, or more or less territorial, or more or less involved in crime, and so on. So there's a lot of different factions, if you will. The NGIC basically divides these street gangs into 2 broad categories. The first would be what we call neighborhood-based gangs, and you can shorten it up for NBG, with no known leadership beyond their just general area or community. And then the second one would be these national level gangs. Now, the majority of gangs, about 88%, belong to these types of gangs, these neighborhood gangs. And these neighborhood based gangs are most problematic because they're engaged in violence and turf wars, etc. And a lot of times, but not 100%, they are organized by ethnicity. So again, typically they're going to kind of stick with their own, if you will, but it's not always the case. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. All right, so a little bit more. We're going to look at a couple of street gangs. So between 1910 and about 1925, there was a a great influx of immigrants that arrived from Mexico, which later formed some rivalries and some small gangs. And in the 1930s, they brought families from Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And as they arrived, they started claiming different territories. Now, Hispanic gangs, they are very traditional. And a couple of gang names that you might recognize would be MS-13, which is typically one of the larger and most dangerous and feared gangs. Some other ones that maybe you've heard of would be 18th Street or Latin King. So again, this is just kind of a brush of some different types of gangs. And again, sometimes you can look at tattoos to tell them apart, from which gang they're from, etc. African American gangs, we'll look at a couple of the larger ones. So founded in 1969 in Los Angeles, California, the Crips are primarily an African American, but not exclusively, street gang that was formed to battle neighboring street gangs. And this group was founded by Stanley Tookie Williams and Raymond Lee Washington, who decided to merge their smaller local gangs, who are mostly, around the age of 17. And Crip members can be identified by the color blue that is typically worn by their members. And again, you can look at some of the photos I have here, and you can see that that's going to be the color. And you can see that these street gangs, again, they're very dangerous. And these are the larger of some of the street gangs, but just to kind of show you. Another gang, the Bloods, founded in 1972 in Los Angeles, California. The Bloods, they are also a primarily African-American street gang, but not primarily, especially now. That was initially formed to compete against the influence of the Crips. And Blood members, of course, can be identified by the color red that is worn by their members. Now, keep that in mind. These colors aren't exclusive. You'll see different members wear different colors. Okay, and sometimes it's based maybe on where they're at. So let's say if you're looking at grapes, a Grape Street Crip, you might see the color purple rag or something. So again, Lime Hood Piru, you're going to see a green rag. So we're just kind of talking in generics, but you'll start to see other things. And that's where learning a lot of this, is very, very important. So again, in general, Bloods you can see by the color red. And again, in here you can even see you've got black. So depending upon what neighborhood you're from and what your gang name is, etc. But typically it's going to be the red. Asian gangs, various groups, in the United States consist of members of Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, and Filipino ethnicity. These gangs are typically highly structured but very low profile. Some things that they are involved in are going to be drug dealing, etc., but also gambling and home invasion robberies, and sometimes a little bit of prostitution. The larger gangs that you may know would be Tiny Rascals, Asian Boys, or Born to Kill. And they're no different than some of the other gangs. Again, I mean, they have the gang signs, and again, so you look at some different colors. So the Asian Boys, they wear blue. So you'll see some gray, but typically some blue in there. Some other types of gangs, again, and we'll get into some other larger pieces here in a minute. Might be white gangs. Gangs like the Skinheads, Aryan Youth Movement, Aryan Brotherhood, the Stoners. These are some other types of gangs. And sometimes it's easy to figure out what gang they're from because it's written, or it's, on a big tattoo on them. So again, these are all, and we'll talk about tattoos. Okay, so now let's look at prison gangs. Because we've kind of ran the gamut on basic street gangs. And some of those street gangs, like the Crips and the Bloods, they're going to be bigger. They're the larger, more national type gangs. Okay, so prison gangs, although prison gangs would seem to be more of a problem for just the corrections personnel. The reality is that most incarcerated gang members will one day be released back into the streets. In fact, some of the most violent street gangs to plague our country were born behind bars, meaning they actually started in prison. Now, the NGIC estimates that there are approximately 230,000 gang members incarcerated in the nation's federal and state prisons, with prison gang members comprising about 9.5% of the nation's total gang population. And their large numbers and dominant presence allows prison gangs to employ things like, crimes like bribery, intimidation, and violence to exert influence and control over a lot of the correctional facilities and the inmates inside of those facilities. And violent disputes over drug control, drug territories, etc., occur among incarcerated gang members. So prison gangs, they operate inside of correctional facilities, and they a lot of them are recidivists, meaning that they've been incarcerated, they'll get out, but they'll come back. And they are self-perpetuating criminal entities, again, because of that level of recidivism. So they're kind of in and out, if you will. Their membership can often thrive. These prison gangs ensure protection, but they also employ, again, bribery, intimidation, and violence. And typically these gangs are clicked up by ethnicity inside of the prisons. And you can, if you watch some TV specials on different prisons, you'll see how they are kind of clicked up in their different ethnic groups. And a lot of it is, again, for protection. So the other type, or the third type of gang that the NGIC has identified, we're talking about those kind of three categories, would be outlaw motorcycle gangs. And outlaw motorcycle gang members comprise about 2.5% of the nation's total gang population. And the NGIC defines an outlaw motorcycle gang member as an organization whose members use their motorcycle club as a conduit for criminal enterprise. Now, a subset of outlaw motorcycle gangs are what they call these one percenters. And this is any group of motorcyclists who have voluntarily made a commitment to band together to abide by their organization's rules enforced by violence, and who engage in activities that bring them and their club into repeated and serious conflict with society. So they're kind of the core group that commit a lot of the criminal activity. So, kind of an overview. Many members of outlaw motorcycle gangs, they are well educated. They are increasingly collaborating with organized crime, specifically methamphetamine sales. They routinely and systematically attempt to exploit and infiltrate law enforcement and other government agencies. And typically it's the girlfriend or the spouse. So working at the DMV in order to get information, or working at a law enforcement agency as, let's say, a records clerk or a property clerk or something like that, in order to get information. We talked a little bit about what a one percenter is. Now, there is, an estimated 44,000 members belong to approximately 3,000 outlaw motorcycle gangs nationwide. And, typically, Um, these gangs primarily, their source of income is drug trafficking, but they're also involved in murders, assaults, kidnapping, prostitution, money laundering, weapons trafficking, intimidation, extortion, arson, and smuggling. Now, the major outlaw motorcycle gangs in the United States are the Hells Angels, the Banditos, the Outlaws, the Mongols, the Pagans, the Vagos, and the Wheels of Soul. And you can see a couple of pictures. Now, an interesting fact, a lot of times these gangs try to help with their image by getting involved in a lot of fundraising. Now, take the Hells Angels. I mean, they have like a toy drive every year that probably gathers more toys for kids than almost any other organization. And it really is to help kind of make their image be a little bit better, if you will. But we still know that some of those core members are typically involved in a lot of gang activity. And you can recognize these individuals and their gangs by those that have earned their vests and their patches. So, here again, you have to reach a certain level in order to be allowed to wear the patch. Okay? So, and then sometimes you'll even see the little patch of the 1%er. So if you look right here, sorry about that, you can see there, but you can see the 1%, that little diamond. That person is a 1%er. So you'll see that on and that's a hardcore. You have to do certain things in order to become a 1%er. Okay, so what about ladies? What about females and gangs? So although gangs are, and gang membership really overall remain predominantly male, female presence is in fact on the rise, and many jurisdictions are experiencing increased activity of all female gangs in addition to female participation as a full-fledged member in a male-dominated gang. So does that make sense? So there's two things we're kind of talking about. One is there are all-female gangs, but now we're actually seeing females in a male-dominated gang, but they are full-fledged members. They're not just the spouse or the girlfriend. They're actual members. Does that kind of make sense? Now, while female gang members typically, overall, support male gang members by serving as drug mules or weapons couriers or gathering intel for the gang. Again, many of these female gang members have begun to take more active roles by becoming either full-fledged gang members, becoming soldiers, and even co-conspirators in a lot of the crimes that are taking place. So females do have their own gangs. They're just not quite seen as much because they're not as prevalent. And again, you can tell females are no different, whether they're in a male-dominated gang and they're a full-fledged member, or whether they are, in their own gang themselves. Different tattoos are going to distinguish where they're from, and hand signs, and that's typical. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about gang culture, membership, and organization. So, and just like with any group, there's going to be a culture. So some gang experts talk about the 3 R's of the gang culture: reputation, respect, and revenge. Now, reputation really is of prime concern or primary concern. These gang members, they expect and sometimes they even demand respect. And they are required to show disrespect for rival gangs, which is kind of like dissing them, which is kind of a slang term. And disrespect inevitably leads to that 3rd R, that we're going to kind of bring up now, which is called revenge. Because every challenge for gang members must be answered, and often that challenge is answered in the form of violence, including, drive-by shootings, beatdowns, homicides, etc. So again, you can see the R's that we're talking about. Some symbols. So again, talking about culture, membership, and kind of the organization. So gang symbols are also very common. Clothing, hand signals, graffiti, and tattoos are all used as symbolic representations of a person's affiliation with a specific gang. Clothing and jewelry are often the most distinguishing characteristics, things that you'll be able to see. Gangs often associate themselves with certain colors, which we've learned, and some members use jerseys or t-shirts or even athletic team logos, bandanas and belts and belt buckles to display their allegiance. So again, part of you being a good investigator is being able to pick out certain things. Tattoos might be covered, but you're going to be able to see the outer clothing, or somebody flashing a hand sign, or throwing up some graffiti, or wearing a certain type of hat. Okay, so just keep all of these things in mind, okay? Now, along with, membership and organization is going to come what we call, gang turf, and we're going to kind of look at turf and graffiti at the same time. So many gangs establish turf. That's the geographic area of domain that the gang members typically defend. And gangs also will identify their turf through graffiti. So they don't post signs, they basically throw up graffiti. And other gangs may challenge that area's gang, by riding over or crossing out or throwing up, meaning throw up their gang, not throwing up like throw up, their area's gang graffiti, and replacing it with their own. They might also use graffiti to honor the other members. So they're going to use graffiti again to mark their own turf, but sometimes gangs that are coming through, they're going to disrespect that gang by replacing it with their own. So they're going to throw up their own gang stuff. And they'll also honor their fallen comrades, their other gang members, through graffiti. So graffiti then is really known as the newspaper of the street. You need to learn how to read gang graffiti if you're going to be a proficient gang investigator. So, graffiti is often highly artistic, but it's very detailed, displaying really important gang symbols, nicknames, their monikers, and even weapons. And graffiti can provide investigators with important intelligence, including, again, gang members' names, their monikers, their territory. It's important for investigators to recognize the difference between, gang graffiti and also tagging. So you know what tagging is, right? It's from those little tagger crews where they're not really like sophisticated gangs that we're kind of talking about. So when you look at gang graffiti, and I'm showing you a couple of pictures again, you'll see some interesting things. Now, I'm not going to take the time to point everything out, but you can see the word blood here. Now, an interesting thing, remember, so if these are Bloods, they don't like Crips, right? So anytime you see a C, even though maybe they need to write the C, they're going to cross through it, because C means Crip. See, look right here. They're going to cross through that. They do that just because they're blood gangs, right? So, and again, you have to be able to read it. And as you get better, you'll start to be able to, see what they're talking about. Same thing here. So you've got somebody that crossed out, and then 187, which means murder, right? So, if you read this, you can start to see who's warring with who. Here's a great piece of graffiti, and here's the name of the gang. Now, the interesting thing is when we look at how gangs find their names. So, in the city of Compton, and that's where this graffiti is from, there's a lot of streets that they're named after different trees. Spruce and this and that. So this is treetop pyrus. Okay, and again, they cross out the C because they don't want to have the crip. And again, you can see here 187. They're gonna. But look here, you've got all the monikers. Pop rock. Okay, look at this. Look at all the difference. Batman. You've got the monikers of the gang: Joker, Iceman. So it's actually a roll call for you. So as you get better at reading this, you're gonna know kind of what's going on. And then finally, again, and then we'll kind of move on. Turf. Remember, that's the geographic area. So remember, I told you that in Compton you could kind of, and there's other gangs, of course, but you can look at the blue. These are areas dominated by the Crips typically, and the red would be areas that are known to be frequented and dominated by the Bloods. So you can actually, and again, it's too hard to see the little names, but here's where most of the Rollin' 60s hang out. Here's where most of the 8 trays. You have the shotgun Crips, etc. Here you have Inglewood family Bloods, Central Park Bloods. So you can just kind of look and it'll tell you. Okay, so let's look a little bit more. Again, we're still talking about culture, membership, organization. Let's talk about tattoos. So tattoos are also used by some gang members, but usually it's most or almost all. And gang tattoos are meant to intimidate and show gang affiliation and also indicate rank. They're kind of the gang member's permanent record of who they are and where they have been and maybe where they did their time at and maybe even how long and maybe even how many murders. So being able to read tattoos, just like gang graffiti, is extremely important. So if you look at this gentleman's face, you can see that 155th is 155th, okay, and Compton, okay, so you kind of know, but show you a couple other ones. So look at prison tattoos. So they might be a little bit different than just the average street gang tattoo. But what does this tattoo show you if you were going to look at it? You've actually got the inmate number here. So you have the person's name and the inmate number. So that's kind of, that's very helpful. Look at this one and tell me if you should be concerned with this individual, because what do you see? This is a prison tattoo, and you see the inmate choking out a guard. So again, it doesn't mean that this guy is going to choke you out if you meet him on the street, but it should let you know that this person might be involved in violence or at least was in prison, and that might have been his mindset at the time, right? So you should be on your lookout, just kind of paying attention. All right, so now let's take a look at some different gang activities. So gang members engage in a wide variety of illegal activities. And gang members are responsible for, on the average, about 48% of violent crime in most jurisdictions and in most states. And in some states, up to even 90%. Now, research shows that gang members are of course, more criminally active than non-members. And that would definitely make sense. But street gangs, again, they're involved in a host of violent criminal activities, assault, drug trafficking, extortion, different types of firearms offenses, drive-by shootings, um, home invasions, robberies, murders, intimidations, weapons trafficking, etc. So just a lot of different types of crimes that these gang members are involved in. You can see it on the news all the time. So, just understand that they're involved in all types of violence. So again, if you're a gang investigator or just a regular detective, you're going to have to know the types of crimes they commit. It's important to understand the types of crimes that they commit. So with all of that, and before I move on to the next section, on page 630 in your textbook, there's a large table that actually takes up 2 pages. So it's on 630 and 631. And it actually talks about the different types of groups or gangs and any type of subgroup that's within that gang, and they'll actually give you the actual distinct name of the gang and the type of criminal activity that they tend to be involved in. So that's some pretty good information for you to know. All right, a couple of other quick things before I move on. Talking about gangs and drugs and gangs and violence. And until about the early 1980s, when crack or rock cocaine hit the market, gangs engaged primarily in crimes like burglary, robbery, extortion, and auto theft. And although drug trafficking existed at that time, it was nowhere near the current levels as it is today. And the reason is the enormous profit. Economic gain is often the reason that kids join gangs. And as I said before, it's really hard to convince a young kid that, who might be making $7 an hour bussing tables or something similar, that's better than making $600 for 2 hours work as a drug courier. Does that kind of make sense? So today gangs, they remain the primary retail level distributor of most drugs throughout the United States. And as a matter of fact, drug trafficking has been identified as the most common criminal activity engaged in by today's gangs. Gangs really do rely on that street level drug distribution and trafficking as their primary source of revenue, and they supplement their income with crimes that are kind of less risky, like counterfeiting, extortion, even prostitution. And as it relates to, violence, we know that gangs rely on intimidation, force, and violence to maintain power and control over their little areas. Early on in my career, when I worked in Los Angeles, at the height of rock cocaine, the territorial battles were just unbelievable, and we were having homicides like every couple of days. So again, territory is a big deal because that territory is where they market their product. All right, so how then do you recognize? How do we recognize that you have a gang problem in your city or in your area? So failure to recognize or acknowledge the existence of gang activity, whether willingly or through the lack of gang training, dramatically increases a gang's ability to thrive in that community and then develop a power base. Many communities begin to address gang issues only after there's some type of high-profile shooting or something like that. So I guess the first step in dealing with a gang problem is to recognize that you have one. And, recognizing a gang can be challenging, but law enforcement, schools, and communities can be aware of warning signs. Things like graffiti, obvious colors of clothing, tattoos, initiations, So, somebody getting beat down, during lunchtime or something like that at a local school could be a gang initiation. Seeing students throwing, hand signs or different handshakes, using uncommon terms or phrases, and maybe even a sudden change in behavior. So these are things to, kind of look at. Now, just as variation exists in how gangs and groups are defined, there really is no consistent national criteria that's used to identify these individual gang members, right? So again, you just have to pay attention to certain things. And, gang members, they might be identified by their, their names, symbols, their clothing, tattoos, communication styles, graffiti, sign language, etc. And another way to know that there's a problem, again, is you'll start experiencing higher levels of crime. You might even you're starting to experience drive-by shootings and even homicides. And this is a picture of a deceased no-love gang member at time of, or right before time of autopsy. So again, when you start seeing, people that are getting, drive-by shootings and these things that are starting to occur, you should start asking yourself why and start looking around, because you might start to have a gang problem in your community and you need trained individuals to start dealing with it. Now, just as, and we kind of looked back here, we talk about recognizing the gang problem, seeing graffiti, seeing colors, tattoos, different things like that. Well, same thing with identifying the actual members. Again, names, symbols, clothing, tattoos, communication style, graffiti, sign language. You're going to identify the members themselves kind of the same way. And here, you've got, gang throwing their stuff up here. They've got the gang signs. So here's G-Man and Axel, and kind of interesting, right? Now, an interesting thing here. Remember, we saw the C's that were crossed out for Bloods. So these are Crips, and you're going to see the B's crossed out because they want to put block, because there's going to be whatever, it's going to be Santana block, whatever the block is. So they want to put block there, but they don't like the B, so they're going to cross the B. They're still going to use the B. So again, interesting, right? So the gang names themselves, as I said, they kind of vary from, the very colorful to the straightforward, and sometimes the gang names are based on locality, like their streets, 151st Street, 132nd Street, or Grape Street. Okay, so here you can see this was basically thrown up by some Grape Street gang members, and they got a little artistic by drawing the grapes, etc. But they live on Grape Street. Sometimes it's animals, sometimes it's royalty, sometimes it's rebellion. Names are different. You can actually go here to streetgangs.com, and if you click on this link, it'll take you to the Crip area. You click on this one, you can go to the Blood area, and you can look at all the different names of the gangs. So again, locality, animals, royalty, rebellion. All right, so how do we keep track of all of these individuals now? And is it important for us to do so? So information is an essential tool for any investigator, and an effective record system is crucial in dealing with any gang problem. An effective way to keep track of information and intelligence is to sort data into two different files: a gang file and a gang member file. Now, a gang file should be maintained with information like the type of gang. Is it a street gang, motorcycle gang, etc.? the ethnic composition, the number of active and associate members, the territory, where they hang out, the types of crimes that they usually commit, their method of operation, the choice of targets, the type of victims, leadership, and those members to be known as to be violent. And if there's a group photo of that gang, which a lot of times you might find during a search warrant or something, you should include that. Now, included within the record system should be a gang member file that kind of cross-references the names of the suspected gang members with that gang file. And that can be on a card or a computerized file. So it's kind of separate, right? So we have two separate files. A lot of gang units only have one file, but you can have one or two. But a gang member file should include a photograph, or more if available, a description and a photo of the member's vehicle that they might drive. It should also include the gang member's moniker, which is the nickname used by that gang member amongst their other gang member peers and while they're hanging out with the gang. And other helpful information to put in the file, if you have it, would be the gang member's cell phone number, their address where they live, any employment information, any known relationships, especially girlfriends or boyfriends, or brothers or sisters, etc. So again, it's important. So, yes, it's important to keep records on file. The gangs, the gang members, to know their monikers, photographs, vehicles, all their illegal activities, and be able to cross-reference all of this information. And you could do that by a couple of different things. What you're looking at right here is from the San Bernardino County Sheriffs. They use this card, and it's either a field interview card or a gang card, and you can see it has all of this different information on it. So it has like the date of contact, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is just some important information. So the location where you contacted them, what kind of contact it was, what is the gang name, okay? The criteria for a gang card, so it's going to have that listed down here, and then the officer's name. So you can use this for, let's say, courtroom testimony. So on the back of this card, so if you're going to do a gang card, and on the back here is the reason that you contacted them, and you're going to mark the criteria, if they have any facial hair here, if they have any tattoos, and what those tattoos are, whether they're a self-admitted gang member or not. So these are really, and you file these away, and they can be hard copy or they can be computerized. So you can probably see already the value. Some departments also have larger cards. So here is a San Bernardino County gang ID card. And it has all of this other information, kind of like the other card I showed you. And again, it talks about the colors they were wearing, etc., the gang, and it has a picture of the person. And a lot of these are hard copy or they can be computerized. One of the most important pieces for an investigator is going to be what's called an inmate classification form. Now think about this. A lot of detectives don't remember this, but anytime you go to county jail or prison, you're going to be basically classified if you're a gang member, right? Because they're not going to put a gang member from one gang into a different area where they're going to get killed. And here, and most gang members, because they're going to be in a jail setting or a prison setting, they're going to want to admit their gang membership, right? So these forms, these classification forms are really important. So look at section 8. And it says self-admitted, which means this guy admitted he was a gang member. He said the gang was East Side Santa Paula, 12th Street. His nickname, his moniker is Rambo. Here are his tattoos. So he admitted that. So is this a great piece of information? The answer is yes, especially if you were going to do a search warrant or something. So again, it's great. This part here, This number 8, super, super important, you guys. Okay, so let's take a look at investigating gang activity, and then we'll take our first break. Actually, it's probably a good time we could take a break right now. So this is going to be our first break. So this will conclude part 1 of chapter 19, talking about gangs and some other dangerous groups that we'll get to at the end of this lecture.